Thanks a lot for the introduction, Jackson. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and thanks a lot for your interest in our research. I'm a PhD student at the University of Zurich, and I'm currently visiting UBC and working together with Gail on a couple of more studies. And I'm super happy to be here today and talk to you about our work, which is about increasing developer productivity by increasing developers' awareness about work and productivity through self-monitoring and goal setting. Software is eating the world. That's one of the most famous quotes probably in the software engineering world by Mark Anderson, one of the co-founders of the Netscape browser and the Anderson and Horowitz investment firm. And it expresses very well that the need for software is constantly outstripping our ability to supply it. And one way to still the world's hunger for software is to make developers more productive so that in the same time they can create more software and better quality software. Of course, this idea is not new, and research and also industry have been trying to increase developer productivity for ages. But one challenge here is that we often don't really know how developers actually work, how their workdays look like, and what the aspects are that influence their work and their productivity. As a result, when we look at productivity and we try to measure the improvements that we do to our systems or our processes, oftentimes we just look at output-related measures. So we would measure productivity with number of lines of code and function points the developer creates per month, or we look at the tasks developers complete each day or each month. And of course, that's not really a very reliable measure, and people could easily game it, and it doesn't really display the whole story. So it's also of interest to us to better understand what it really means to individual software developers to be productive. What are things that happen on productive days? What doesn't go well on unproductive days, and so on. And finally, researchers found that developers are oftentimes not really aware of what happens during their work and what factors influence successful and unsuccessful days. And that's exactly something we want to change. So we want to increase developers' awareness about those topics. Yesterday, when I was browsing Twitter, I actually found a nice quote that helps us to motivate this work. So this guy, Rob Norris, he was actually complaining on Twitter that on a regular workday, he spends 95% of his time with random bullshit, which I assume he refers to help fixing bugs and troubles, infrastructure issues, setting up things, administrative tasks, and so on. And from the remaining 5% of the time, he actually spends only about, at least he expects, he only spends about 5% of his time actually writing code. And when he actually gets a chance to write code, he always feels bad because he has the impression that he should be doing something else. And that's totally bad and frustrating, right? And I think this motivates very well why we should try to better understand what developers are working on, help developers to get better insights into their own work habits, to help them better optimize their work overall. How am I planning? Oh no. And actually in another work unrelated area, it has been shown that physical trackers such as the Fitbit or the Apple Watch or Garmin trackers and so on, they are super successful at increasing people's awareness about a certain topic. So in that case, in the health and physical activity domain, we were very successful at showing people to walk more, use the stairs instead of the elevators, eat healthier, and so on. So our goal is to map the success of these activity trackers to the software engineering domain and help developers and individuals at the workplace to become more productive. How do I plan to do this? Or how are we doing this? We set out and defined 3 research questions that guide our research. The first one being, what does it really mean for a developer to work productively? How do their work days look like? And so on. And we then wanted to use these insights to help developers get exactly those insights about their own work as well, and define behavior changes or come up with behavior changes that make them happier and more productive. And we actually did this for whole teams as well as individuals. And as a final step, we actually wanted to make these insights more actionable so that developers get recommendations, for example, of how they could improve themselves based on some patterns and behaviors at work. So let's start with the first part on understanding developers' productivity. We actually run a couple of studies, including surveys, observations, and a monitoring tool study. Some of these studies we were also be able to do here at Tasktop. And what was very interesting to see is when we asked developers to define what a productive workday means to them, they told us that usually they feel most productive when they get a lot of stuff done, when they make progress on their tasks and have very few and little interruptions and distractions. They were also really vocal about meetings and emails, and most developers mentioned that they absolutely detest them. Some developers explained this a little bit further and mentioned that meetings when everybody's prepared and meetings that have a clear outcome and goal are usually more productive, and usually collaboration is a lot better in those meetings, but overall developers didn't really seem to see a lot of value in them. Of course, this is also very different and varies a lot across companies. When we ask developers how they would like to measure productivity and if they would like to measure productivity, developers came up with a whole bunch of different measures, and no measure was really the most important or most interesting ones, which emphasizes how different an individual developer's perceptions of productivity is, and that it's actually super hard, if not impossible, to measure productivity at all. This is also why we concluded that they should probably not measure productivity, but help developers to learn what happens when they are productive and when they are not productive, instead of just putting a number behind their work. We also looked at developers' work on a longer scale, and we tried to find out what they actually do during their work. So I literally sat behind some developers and noted down all the activities they were working on, programs they were using, information about their tasks and context, and then we visualized that in a timeline. What you see here on the x-axis is the time, and on the y-axis the different participants, and in the background of each axis you see different shades of grays, which denote the different tasks developers are working on when they were switching on a task, and all the colors and shapes, they visualize activities developers were working on at that particular time. So for example, all the yellowish and orangish and reddish colors are different development activities, such as coding, testing, code reviewing, and so on. And green, for example, are informal or formal meetings. Since the picture is super busy, I will now zoom in a little bit and explain what we found. So this participant S1, in just 4 hours when I observed this developer, he had 148 task switches, 20 activity switches, 27 task switches, and worked on 4 different tasks. We were super surprised to see this high number of task and activity switches. And this was also the same for most other developers. So on average, they switched 13.5 times between tasks each hour and 47 times between activities each hour. This high context switching shows that developers must actually be pretty good at multitasking. If you think back on the previous slide where we found that developers feel productive when they have little context switches and interruptions, we must think or assume that they all felt really unproductive, right? But they didn't. Interestingly, almost everyone felt pretty productive on that day. This was either because I was sitting behind them and they were motivated to work better, or it could also have another reason. When I interviewed them about their context switching, we learned that the cost of context switching varies. Interruptions are often bad, especially when a person is really focused and immersed in a task, because they have to resume it later and rebuild their mental model of their task. There are also shorter context switches that developers do. For example, when they quickly switch to their email client and answer a quick email or do a quick code review. Those short context switches are oftentimes kind of productive, especially when a developer is waiting for a build to complete, for a test suite to run, and so on. So far we've learned that developers feel most productive when they can work on their tasks, make progress on their tasks, and somehow produce output, and also work on meaningful things. Especially, they feel better or more productive when they experience very few context switches and interruptions. Because so far the whole study setup didn't really scale well, we installed a monitoring tool on developers' computers that non-intrusively tracked some of their behaviors on the computer, including user input, programs they were using, files they were working on, and so on. And from that data, we could actually get more insights over more workdays and so on. What I found there was actually kind of fascinating. So overall, developers spend surprisingly little time actively working on their computers, just about half of their workdays. Also, overall, they only spend about 1/4 of their workdays with coding-related activities. Everything else is spent with collaboration, looking things up, administration, infrastructure issues, emails, and so on. We once again also looked at how often developers are switching between different activities. And here we found, again, that developers switch very often, on average, and every 20 seconds to 2 minutes. This shows how fragmented developers' workdays are. Of course, not all of these context switches are bad. So when a developer switches from the IDE to Stack Overflow, for example, that's probably not a very expensive switch. But there is also the chance of a distraction. For example, the developer might see an interesting post or work unrelated post in Stack Overflow and help out another developer, or see a notification on Facebook and 20 minutes later realizes that he or she actually didn't spend the time working. Another interesting thing we found here is that the times developers spend on certain activities varies a lot across companies. So for example, with emails, developers here at Tasktop on average spent about 1 minute each day with emails. In other companies, it was 78 minutes. So this shows that if you want to optimize productivity and workflow and work habits, we should also take this individual as well as team and company-wide differences into account. We cannot just build something and hope it works for everyone. We once again visualized activities developers were working on a timeline, and what you see here is 5 different days of a single developer. So you've seen before that their workdays are very fragmented and they switch a lot between activities, but we can actually also spot certain patterns. So for example, on the 3rd day, that developer spent most of the time with development-related activities and had very little time spent with other activities. On the other hand, the next day, that developer spent most of the time with collaborative activities in meetings, emails, planning, and so on. This gave us more insights into how we could help developers to optimize their workdays. So for example, on a development-heavy day, it might be important to reduce interruptions because they really want to focus on making and producing output and coding. On the other hand, on collaborative heavy days, reducing interruptions, as an example, is probably not as important because they are discussing things with others anyway and sending emails and so on, which is very often something you don't really need to focus a lot. In the study, we also showed this pop-up asking developers once an hour to self-report whether they felt productive or not. This actually allowed us to compare and correlate all the data we collected with the productivity perception. We found out that perceived productivity and the factors that influence productivity vary a lot, and they are very, very individual. We were actually able to build personalized models that predict developers' perceived productivity based on some factors, but none of these models could be reused for another developer. Nonetheless, we found some patterns, some habitual patterns in developers' workdays. So for example, when we plotted developers' perceptions over the day, we realized that every developer could be grouped into one of these 3 groups. So every developer is either a morning person, low and lunch person, or an afternoon person. So for example, during the afternoon people, which was the biggest group, they usually arrive a bit later at work in the day, start their days with emails and meetings, go to lunch, and then they kickstart their days and get most of the stuff done, most of their tasks done in the afternoon, where they also feel most productive. So far we've learned that developers' perceptions of productivity varies a lot, which makes it super hard to measure productivity. Also, workdays are very different. Everybody organizes their work very differently, and everybody expects something different in their workdays. But overall, most developers would like to code more, and they would like to help them be able to spend more time in development. And this is something we did with the next project I want to talk briefly about. In this project, our goal was to increase developers' awareness about interruptions. So here I have another post from Twitter that I found on a whiteboard, which explains why interruptions are so bad. The problem is that most people think when they interrupt us and then they leave, we can immediately resume our tasks and continue to make progress. But in reality, we actually spend 15 to 25 minutes to recover from the interruption and resume the previous task, because we have to rebuild our mental model of the task. And if we are interrupted every 20, 30 minutes, it actually makes it super hard to make progress and have some deep work hours without interruptions, where you can actually think and create good quality, high quality code. There were also studies on interruptions in more general, and in the United States, it's estimated that interruptions, not just for developers, but for other knowledge workers as well, cost the economy about $588 billion every single year. So there's a huge potential to save money and also make people happier because they actually can get some stuff done. Of course, not all interruptions are bad. Oftentimes it's important to take a break, talk about soccer or hockey or whatever, but sometimes when I really need to focus and I'm interrupted all the time, it makes it very hard to make progress. What did we do about these costly, intrusive context switches? We created the FlowLight. The FlowLight is a physical traffic light-like system that visualizes the developer's focus in a small light bulb. It turns red when the developer is fully focused and when an interruption is probably very expensive. It is green to show other developers that at the moment an interruption is probably not as expensive and everybody can come by and ask their questions. And it's yellow when the developer is away. The FlowLight is basically the simple light and an automated algorithm that looks at the developer's computer interaction and tries to approximate the developer's current focus. Of course, the developer can also do this manually to reduce some team pressure if a person's light never goes to red and so on, and it learns from developers and so on. We studied the FlowLight with 450 developers in 12 different countries at ABB, and we were actually surprised by how well it worked, because the algorithm was super, super basic. It reduced about 50% of all the costly interruptions. But it not only directly reduced interruptions, it also increased everybody's awareness about interruptions. So teams would start to discuss how they could better manage their collaboration when they want to have times for meetings, for example, during times when everybody doesn't really feel productive, and so on. Or some teams introduced no meeting days. So every Tuesday, for example, they would not be allowed to schedule meetings because those were the day where developers could just focus on their own work. So overall, developers felt much more productive and were also more motivated at work. I think it's a cool example to see how something super simple can actually be pretty successful. And people were also very excited about the whole study. So for example, during Halloween, some people would add little zombies on top of the light, or one person who wasn't part of the study invented the pig chart, where she basically added a number of pigs on her cubicle that would visualize how focused she currently is. And we were also super happy to see that the media picked up on the topic, and as a result, the company approached us, and we are now licensing the whole system to Embrava, which will soon release it. And I think it's super nice because it's one of the rare examples of where a research project actually has real-world impact on the industry. Maybe very similar to how Tasktop was founded with Mylin. Besides increasing developers' awareness about interruptions, I also wanted to focus more on individual developers and help developers to learn more about themselves, their own work habits, and so on. But the problem was that we don't really know how we should create such a self-monitoring system. There were a couple of those around, such as Rescue Time and Code-alike, but it was not really clear what developers expect and what measures they would want to see, and how all of this correlates somehow to productivity. So we followed a mixed methods approach, where we looked at these tools, related work, and we iteratively developed such a self-monitoring tool, also with some developers here at Tasktop, and came up with a final result. The final tool is called Personal Analytics, and it collects a whole bunch of information on a developer's computer, which includes programs they're using, code reviews they are doing, files they're working on, websites they visit, emails, meetings, user input, and so on. And of course, it was extensible, so developers could also add hooks to their repository and version control systems, or other people added their Fitbit data and Garmin sleep data, and so on. We also included the pop-up that you've seen before, and all of the data is then collected and summarized, and then visualized in a daily and a weekly summary. And here you see a screenshot of how the daily summary, the retrospection, could look like. We then evaluated this personal analytics tool with 43 developers at Microsoft, and as a result, we found out about important design recommendations for building such self-monitoring tools for the workplace. And I want to talk about two of them in a little bit more detail. In the pilot studies, the pop-up actually consisted of 6 or 7 questions. So it actually interrupted people a lot, and everybody hated the pop-up because it was so intrusive and it took them a minute or two to respond to. When we improved the pop-up to just contain this one single question, how productive have you been the previous hour, people slowly started to like the pop-up. And actually the whole engagement increased, and they answered the pop-up more frequently. What was super surprising to see there is that many developers actually liked the pop-up at the end of the study, because once an hour they would briefly reflect about whether they had spent their time efficiently, or whether they are maybe stuck on an issue and should take a break or ask a coworker. I think that's a good example of how this experience sampling method could be useful for us to learn more about people and collect data, but also to increase people's awareness about a topic. The whole retrospection was also successful at increasing people's awareness about their work habits, and so on. And about 40% of all developers try to change their behaviors, try to become more productive. So for example, one participant mentioned that he learned that he usually slacks off during the mornings because he doesn't really feel a lot of pressure, and that he should actually try to set specific goals and try to get more stuff done in the mornings. Or another example was that people were very, very surprised by how much time they spend with emails. So they would close their email clients, maybe disable the email notification pop-ups, and so on, to reduce the time they spend with emails. Or people would just come to work a bit earlier or leave a bit later, because those were the times they actually could spend with less interruptions. However, the big problem was that for also about 40% of all participants, the insights were nice and they learned something, but they had no idea what they could change. The reason is that these insights were not actionable, not concrete enough. And developers asked us to add recommendations based on their patterns, based on their behaviors, and so on. And I think, and I also briefly discussed this with Sam before, I think one of the reasons is that we very rarely reflect about our work habits. We often reflect about what we do, what we did, the output we produced, the issues we closed, and so on. But we rarely reflect about how we actually came there and what we did and didn't do and what went well and so on in going there. And that's something we want to change with this next study that I'm working on right now. We want to help developers not only increase their awareness, but also reflect more heavily on their work and support them in coming up with concrete and actionable behavior change plans. And this is actually a study I'm working on right now, so if some of you are interested in participating, please send me an email or write down your name over there, and I will briefly explain the study. So the goal is to find out how we can help developers to improve and maintain good work habits. And then we want to use this and add them to the tool that I've shown before, so the tool could actually help developers by recommending certain habits, certain changes, and so on, based on their current activities, based on their personality, and so on. The study looks as follows. There is a short survey and consent form, and then the main part will actually be where the participant is asked to briefly self-reflect about their work once a day in a short questionnaire where they think about what did I actually plan to work on today, what did I actually achieve, and what went well and what didn't go so well. What were pleasures today and what distracted me from work. And then the questionnaire guides developers towards identifying behavior change strategies and goals they could set for themselves to improve themselves. And then this will be rounded off by a short final survey or interview to find out how we could map all of this to the tool. I recently finished a large test run of the study, and people were actually super happy with it, and they were surprised by how much they actually learned about themselves. For example, one person realized that every time when she selects her most important task for the day and immediately starts working on it and just works for a full hour with full focus and without distractions, that it's actually a lot easier to achieve it because she fully commits on doing it. And then she's happy because she starts her day with already having achieved something, and her happiness helps her to achieve even more during the day. So if you decide to participate, I think you will learn a lot about yourself, your work habits, and you could, of course, also help us and the world to learn more about how developers set goals that help them to improve themselves. There is a slight risk of participating, which is the time investment. It will require about 3 to 4 hours of your time during about 3 weeks, but we can, of course, accommodate a good schedule for doing that. So if you're interested in, please drop me a line, please send me an email, or fill out the form, and I thank you in advance. I want to briefly summarize my talk and our work. So we are trying to improve developers' productivity by increasing developers' awareness about what happens on a good day, what goes wrong on a bad day, and what can I do as a person to improve myself. We created FlowLight that reduces interruption and increases people's awareness about the interruptions, and we created the Person Analytics tool, which is a good first start to help developers learn more about themselves. And the current goal of this next study is how can we actually help developers to come up with more concrete behavior change strategies. And I want to thank all my collaborators, including Thomas and Gail, that some of you most likely know. Please, Gail, I'm sure, Thomas Zimmermann from Microsoft Research, Dave Shepard from ABB, and Manuela Züger. She was also here from time to time from the University of Zurich. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.